In this video, we're going to look at server-side rendering, static site generation, and incremental static regeneration in NextJs 13 new app directory. Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Hamid. I'm a full-stack web developer, and here on this channel, we talk about modern web dev topics like React and NextJs. Now, in NextJs 12, we had specific functions like get server-side props and get static props that we could export from our pages that would instruct NextJs how to generate these pages, whether statically at build time or on demand at request time. Now in the app directory, we don't have these functions, but we are using a simpler API that's built on top of the fetch function and async React server components. In this video, we're going to go over the migration guide inside of the NextJs documentation for the app router, which is the beta version of their documentation, and we're going to also create this simple to-do app together to put this concepts in practice by building static pages and contrast them with server-side rendered pages and also incremental static regeneration. So let's go back to the docs where we have this migrating data fetching methods inside of NextJs. And as I explained, inside of the pages directory, we had get server-side props or get static props to fetch pages or data for our pages. Whereas in the app directory, we're going to use the fetch function directly inside of our React server components because they can be turned into async functions, and therefore you can fetch the required data right inside of your components. Now, if you're using the fetch function directly inside of your page components to fetch data, you can pass in options such as cache, force cache to instruct NextJs to cache the result of this fetch function until it is manually invalidated. Or you can pass in no store that instructs NextJs not to store the result of this fetch function, so therefore it will be dynamic, just like get server-side props. You can also pass options like this next revalidate to replicate the incremental static regeneration we had in the pages directory or in NextJs 12. Now this fetch function is an extension of the fetch API. That's why you're able to pass this custom options to it, such as this next revalidate. But oftentimes, if you're not using fetch directly when we're interacting with our databases or when we're fetching data, oftentimes we have database clients. For example, in our app, we're going to be using MongoDB to fetch our to-dos, and we're not directly using this fetch function to be able to pass these options to it. And that's where your route config options come into place. So these segment config options allow you to define the behavior of your page by exporting these variables from your page or your layouts. Now, specifically, we're going to talk about dynamic and revalidate, which will define the behavior of your page, replicating get static props or get server-side props. We're going to also look at the dynamicParams, which is used together with generateStaticParams, which is for your dynamic segments. So if you're having, let's say, to-dos / and then to-do ID, and you're dynamically rendering that segment, we're going to look at these two functions that help us render dynamic paths. The fetch cache is when you want to override the cache behavior of this new fetch function inside NextJs. It is an advanced feature, and you should only use it if you really want to override the caching behavior of it. So we're not going to touch this. Now, runtime is your runtime. This can be your Node.js or the Edge runtime, and then a region for where your functions would be deployed. So basically, to statically generate pages or make them server-side rendered, we would have to deal with dynamic and revalidate. These are the two options we're going to closely look at. And then we're going to talk about the dynamicParams and generateStaticParams. That's for dynamic segments. Now let's start from the dynamic option. And here you can see this dynamic. You can export it from a page. And this is useful again for when you're not directly working with a fetch function. And we're going to see this in action inside of our code in a second, but let's just read the explanation here before we dive into the code. So this changes the dynamic behavior of a layout or page. If I mention page anywhere in this video, just know that it also can be exported from your layouts too. And if you don't know how this new structure is set up in the app directory, I have a video on the channel where I introduced this new whole structure of layouts and pages. You can watch that to better understand how that's set up. In this video, we are not going to dive deep into that. I assume that you know how pages and layouts work in the app directory. We just want to turn them into static pages versus dynamic pages. Now, this dynamic changes the behavior of the page to fully static or fully dynamic. The possible values are, you can set it to auto, you can set it to force dynamic, to error, and force static. Now, there's a little migration note here that's interesting or good to know. It says the new model in the app directory favors granular caching control at the fetch request level over the binary all or nothing model of get server side props or get static props at the page level. Now, inside of the pages directory, when you are exporting the get server side props from a page, it turns that whole page into a server render page. Or when you export get static props, it turns the whole page to a static page. So it's at the page level. Whereas in the new app directory, you can control based on or at the fetch or request level if you want a specific request to be dynamic or versus a specific request being static. Now, this dynamic option, which is a route config option you can export from any page or layout, is a way to opt back into the previous model as a convenience and provides a simpler migration path. So by exporting this dynamic, you're kind of replicating what you were doing in pages directory in NextJs 12, which means that you're defining what happens to the page or layout at the page level. So you're not going into the specific fetch requests and change them at that level. You're just defining the whole page. And this makes it easy for us to migrate our pages to the app directory by just playing around with this dynamic. So let's see what are the values that we can export. We can set this dynamic constant to. So the auto, which is the default, is going to cache as much as possible without preventing a component into opting into dynamic behavior. So if you leave this option alone and don't even export it, it's going to default to auto, which is going to cache as much as possible, or it's going to replicate get static props as much as possible, unless a function is opting into dynamic functions and fetching data dynamically. It is going to be generated statically and it's going to be cached. Now, if you don't want to leave it to auto, you can set it to force dynamic, which forces dynamic rendering, and it's equivalent to your get server-side props inside of your pages directory. Now, this is also similar to passing in these options to your fetch function. So if you're using fetch directly, you can pass a cache no store and next revalidate 0 to turn that fetch request dynamic, meaning that NextJs will not cache the result of the fetch function. Now, we can also change this fetch cache config to be force no store. This is not the default behavior of the fetch function. And as I mentioned, you should only change this if you really want to override the behavior of your fetch function. Now, the next value you can export your dynamic config option is error. And this is going to force static rendering and static data fetching, and it's going to cause an error or a 404 page if the component is trying to render or access any dynamic functions. Again, this is going to be equivalent to your get static props, where every page is rendered statically. So here again, we are forcing a static rendering, and if the page or any component inside of it is going to access any dynamic function, we're going to show a 404. Now, our last value is force static, and as the name implies, it's going to force static rendering and static data fetching, and it's doing so by forcing cookies, headers, and usesearch param functions to return an empty object or value. Now, following the migration guide, it recommends to set the dynamic to force dynamic if we wanted to turn the page into a server render page similar to get server-side props, and also dynamic to error if we wanted to turn it into a static page similar to get static props. So even though the force static is very similar to the error, the documentation recommends setting it to error instead of force static. And to be honest, I'm not quite sure what the exact difference of these two are, but at this point, at least we know this is the recommended way. Let's actually put this into practice. On the left hand side, you can see a NextJs application I created by running npx create next app, and I've turned the experimental app directory flag on so that we have this app directory. And inside of it, as you see, we have these three folders: SSG, SSR, and ISR, which represents static site generation or static pages. The SSR is server-side rendered or our dynamic pages, and the ISR, which is incremental static regeneration, which is going to be when we want to revalidate a statically built page. Now we're going to implement the same pages as we saw in the beginning for this to-do app in the three different strategies and see how we can replicate the behavior of the pages directory or NextJs 12 here. But for now, let's ignore the ISR and SSR and dive into the SSG and see what we're doing there. As you can see, I have a dynamic folder that's going to be responsible for when we are trying to access a specific to-do. And if you can see up there, there's SSG and then the dynamic ID. And then we're going to have this page.jsx inside of the SSG, which is representing this index page, which is @/SSG. Now, again, if you're not familiar with how the app directory is structured, I recommend watching the video that I linked in the card first to understand how the new app directory, the segments, the routes, pages, and layouts works, and then come back to this. Now, inside of our SSG folder, this page, as I mentioned, is representing the index route pointing to /SSG. And now let's dive into this page and see what we're doing here. Now, first things first, we are exporting this page component that's responsible for rendering this specific page. It's a React server component because by default, any component inside of the app directory is a React server component. Therefore, we can turn it into an async function. And that enables us to fetch our data right inside of our page component. So we are calling this get all to-dos function, which we're going to look at in a second. We're getting our to-dos back and we are mapping over our to-dos to render this list. Now we also have this new to-do form, which allows us to add new to-dos to our list over here. And as I mentioned, the idea is when we're building pages statically versus dynamically, we want to be able to add new to-dos and see if they show up on the list over here or not. Now let's quickly look at this get all to-dos function that's helping us connect to our MongoDB database and fetch our to-dos. If you're not familiar with how to integrate MongoDB in NextJS application, I have a video on the channel. You can look that up. It's pretty straightforward, but we are initializing the connection to the database and we're trying to fetch all of our to-dos by calling this function on our collection in MongoDB and then passing the result back over here, which is used directly inside of our page component. Okay, great. Now we have our data. How do we go about turning this page into a static page? Now, as I mentioned, if this was inside the pages directory in NextJS 12, we would have just exported getStaticProps function, and that function would turn this page into a static page that's generated at build time. But here we don't have these functions. Instead, we have this route config options we can export. Now, if you remember, the default value for this dynamic config option was auto, and auto meant that NextJS would try to cache as much as it can unless the component is trying to access dynamic functions like headers and cookies, or it's trying to dynamically fetch data. So let's actually leave this out without exporting any config option and see how would this page behave. Let's go ahead and create a new task. Let's say third to-do task. Now, as you can see, it immediately popped down here in my list. You might think, well, if this page was static, we shouldn't have seen this third option. But the problem is when you're running the development server, everything is going to be server rendered. So to really see the behavior in action, we have to first build our application. And once the build process is done, we have to serve up that production bundle by running npm start instead of npm run dev to just serve up that built application. Okay, so the build process is done. Let me just run npm start to run the production server. And now if I come back to my page and refresh, I still have the 3 tasks that I've created before. Let's now add a 4th task to this and see what happens. As you see this time, the 4th task is not added automatically to the list because this page is built statically at build time, and at build time where the HTML was generated, this last task or 4th task wasn't there. Now to confirm that this actually was creating a task in our database, let me just open up MongoDB Compass and refresh the list of my to-dos. And as you can see here, the 4th task is created here. So this confirms that our page was created statically, and that's because the default value of this dynamic option that we can export from our page is auto, which means Next.js would try to cache as much as possible. And unless the page component is trying to access dynamic functions, it will be generated statically. However, if your page actually tries to access cookies and headers or fetch data dynamically, it's not going to 404, it's not going to error out. It's actually going to run the page component and try to generate that page dynamically. If that's not the behavior you want, and you want to exactly replicate the get static props in Next.js 12, instead of the auto, we can export the dynamic parameter and set it equal to error. This way, we're forcing static rendering, and if a dynamic function is used inside of the page component, it's going to show a 404. Now, as I mentioned, there is an alternative to this, which is force static, which has the similar behavior of the error. And the only difference is that the values for your dynamic functions, such as cookies and headers or use search params, will be an empty value. So it's not going to error, it's not going to 404. And instead it's not going to be able to access the values of those functions. But again, as I mentioned in the docs, it recommends using dynamic error for pages that you want to statically generate, and 404 if it's not static. Now to contrast this with server-side rendering or SSR, let's dive into our SSR folder and access this same page component that's responsible for rendering the page dynamically. And as you can see, we have the same exact page component, fetching our to-dos and passing it down to this list. And the only difference is that when exporting this dynamic option, we are setting it to force dynamic, which forces a dynamic rendering and prevents Next.js from statically generating this page at build time. Now let's test this out. If I go back to my homepage and access this SSR or dynamic route, which points to /SSR, where this page component we just looked at is responsible for rendering the page, we immediately see this 4th task on the list because this page is a dynamic page rendered at request time on demand, and it already has this 4th to-do task. And just to confirm this is the case, if I add another to-do over here, we would see it immediately added to the bottom of the list. Again, this page, with the use of this dynamic config option set to force dynamic, is now forced to be dynamic and rendered at request time. Now with these two out of the way, let's talk about incremental static regeneration, which is useful when you want to update your statically built pages without having to rebuild and redeploy your app. So if you go back to the documentation, there is a section that talks about incremental static regeneration. And as a refresher, inside of the pages directory where you're exporting your get static props from a page to generate that page statically, you can also set a field called revalidate and set it to a number of seconds that you want Next.js to actually invalidate that cache or regenerate this page. So therefore, the next user, after this many amount of seconds, is going to get a newly generated, updated page. Now, in the app directory, we don't have such a function, but as I mentioned earlier, if you're using the fetch API to fetch data directly in your React server component, you can pass in this next revalidate options directly to the fetch function. And if you're not using the fetch function, like our to-do app, you're using a client database to fetch our to-dos, you can export route config options and specifically this revalidate option that does the same thing. So let's actually look at the revalidate config option. We can export from our pages and see what values we can pass and what the behavior would be. So as I mentioned, this revalidate config option defines the revalidation behavior of a layout or a page. You can set it to false, force cache, 0, or a positive number. Now, the default value for revalidate is false, as you can see here, which effectively means that the resource should be cached indefinitely. So it's not going to revalidate our results. As you can see, NextJs default behavior, similar to the dynamic default value, is trying to optimize our pages as much as it can. It's trying to build them statically as much as it can and caches them as much as it can. And if we leave this revalidate to false, which is the default behavior, it's not going to revalidate our resources unless we are using a dynamic function. Now, the other option is to set revalidate to 0, which will ensure that layout or page is always dynamically rendered, even if no dynamic function or dynamic data fetches are discovered. Now, setting revalidate to 0 is the equivalent of setting dynamic to force dynamic, which we saw earlier in our SSR component. So instead of exporting dynamic, we could have exported revalidate to 0, which basically does the same thing, and it ensures that our page or layout is always dynamically rendered. Now, this was just a side note, but to actually see the revalidation of our statically built pages, let's go back to our ISR folder, and inside of our page that renders the same component. As you can see here, we're fetching the to-dos. We're just exporting the revalidate config option, and we're setting it to 10 seconds, which instructs NextJs that after 10 seconds, we want to revalidate the cache, regenerate this page, and then show the regenerated updated page to the next user from that point on. Now, to test this out, if I go back to my home page and access this ISR or revalidate path, which points to /ISR, where this component is responsible for rendering the page, and actually add another to-do task over here, we won't be able to see this immediately on our list because we've set the revalidate property to 10 seconds, which means that NextJs is going to invalidate the cache after 10 seconds, regenerate this page statically, and serve it up. Therefore, if I refresh this page after the 10 seconds, I should be able to see that last 6th to-do task that we just added. Let's recap. So far, we have looked at static site generation, SSR or server-side rendering, and incremental static regeneration, all with the use of exporting route config options. In the beginning, we looked at the dynamic option we can export from every page. This would define or change the behavior of a page from fully static to fully dynamic. The default was auto, which meant NextJs is going to try to statically generate as much as it can. If we wanted to force a static, we could have set it to error, which would force building these pages statically, and it will 404 if we're trying to access a dynamic function or a dynamic data fetching. We did the same thing on our SSR page. We just set it to force dynamic, and this would cause this page to be rendered dynamically. We also saw that instead of this, we could have exported the revalidate 0, which has the same effect of making sure this page is dynamically rendered. And then on the incremental static regeneration, we just export a revalidate set to a positive number of seconds, which is the frequency of revalidation for this specific page. Now, so far, we've only looked at static pages inside of our route segments. How should we go about these dynamic paths that are responsible for rendering these individual to-do tasks? Let me just close this pages, and let's start with static site generation or SSG. Let's dive into this dynamic ID path and the page component inside of it, which is responsible for rendering this individual to-do task. Ignore this generateStaticParams function up top for now. What we're doing down here is we're exporting a React server component that's responsible for rendering that page. It receives the params object from NextJs, and on it, the ID of the page that the user is trying to access. We are using this ID and the function getToDoById from our library to fetch this specific ID from our MongoDB and return it to our page component. If we find it to do with that ID, we're going to render the title. And if there is no to do with that specific ID, we are returning this not found function, which we imported from Next Navigation. This is a new function, which basically returns a 404. Now let's look at this generateStaticParams function that's similar to getStaticPaths inside the pages directory. If I go back to the documentation, and as a refresher, inside of the pages directory for a dynamic path such as this ID, alongside the getStaticProps, which actually returns the data to the page component, you have to export a function called getStaticPaths, which tells Next.js what paths to actually generate statically at build time. Similar to that, we have the generateStaticParams in the app directory, which again returns an array of paths you want Next.js to generate statically at build time. But there's a subtle difference between the two functions, and that mainly is for the pages directory for your dynamic segments like this dynamic ID. If you eliminate this getStaticPaths function, this would error out because Next.js doesn't know what to do or what pages to generate statically. Whereas inside of the app directory, if you eliminate this function altogether, or back in our own example, if we comment this out, our page component will still run and it will still try to fetch this to do and render this page on demand at request time dynamically. So this generateStaticParams function acts more like an optimization technique you could use to tell Next.js what paths or what pages it can generate statically at build time. Now, the reason for this behavior is this dynamicParams config option that works together with this generateStaticParams. If I go back to the docs for route segment config options we've been looking at in this video, one of the config options we can export from a page is this dynamicParams. This works together with generateStaticParams to tell Next.js what should happen if a user is trying to access a page that we did not generate statically or we did not return from this function. So if I scroll down to the dynamicParams part, you can see it can either be true or false. The true, which is the default, means that the dynamic segment not included in the generateStaticParams in this function are going to be generated on demand or dynamically at request time. And if we set it to false, the segments that are not returned from generateStaticParams will return a 404. So let's come back to our page and see what happened actually here. So if we eliminate this and we don't have that set, because the dynamicParams is already defaulting to true, even if we eliminate this generateStaticParams from the page, it will still try to render this page dynamically because this defaults to true, and the true is to generate pages on demand. That's why if we eliminate this function, it still works in the app directory, whereas in the pages directory, if you eliminate getStaticPaths, it will error out. Now, if you want to disable this behavior, you can export your generateStaticParams and actually set your dynamicParams to false. So therefore, if the user is trying to access a path that you did not return from generateStaticParams, it's going to 404. This is similar to the fallback property inside the pages directory. So if I go back to the documentation in the getStaticPaths inside the pages directory, we could set this fallback option inside of our getStaticPaths function, which would determine what should happen if the user is trying to access a path that we have not created. It could be true, false, or blocking. When it's set to true, Next.js is going to show a fallback state to the user. It's going to then generate that page on demand and then swap the fallback with the page component once it's created. If you set the fallback to false, it's going to return an error, return a 404. And the blocking was to block the browser until the page is generated and then render the page. So this is similar to what we have in the route segment options with this dynamic params. We only have true and false. We don't have the blocking option because when it is set to true and we are actually generating the page, it's using React streaming with server components, and the difference is negligible. So therefore there is no blocking option here. It's either true or false. True meaning that if the user is trying to access a segment that we didn't return from generateStaticParams inside of the app directory here, it's going to run the page and tries to generate that page on demand. And when it is set to false, just like the fallback false, it's going to 404 if the user tries to access a page that's not built statically. Let's actually see this in action. I'm going to comment this out, even though it doesn't make any difference because we are running the production server. If I go back to the home page for the static path, as you can see, we're not seeing those extra tasks we added. If I go to this first task, we can see this path rendering. If I open up MongoDB right now, let me just open this up. And let's say we grab the ID. Let me just refresh because I think we have 6 tasks over here. If I grab the ID for this last task that we created, just close this off. Now, if I go back, you see we only see these 3 tasks over here. Again, this is an SSG or static page. At the time we built this page, we only had these 3 tasks. So no matter how many times I refresh, I'm not going to see the other tasks. But interestingly enough, if I go to this first task and actually paste in the ID of that 6th task we created together, we could see this path is generated and rendered dynamically. And the reason for it is what we discussed over here. This generateStaticParams, at the time of the build ran, we had 3 tasks. It instructed NextJs to build those pages statically. But because we are not exporting this dynamicParams function, we weren't doing it then, it defaults to true, which means if you're trying to access a page like this page with this ID that was not returned from this generateStaticParams, this page component is going to run anyways, and it's going to generate and render this page on demand dynamically at request time. Now to contrast this, if I set this to false this time, meaning that I don't want to generate these pages dynamically at request time, if it's not returned from generateStaticParams, I want a 404. Let's actually save this and rebuild our application and see how it would act differently. So npm run build. Now if I start the production server by running npm start, if I actually go back to the index of our SSG or static page, we can see all 6 to-do tasks are here. And if we try to access each individual one, or even the last one, it will be created. But the difference with this dynamicParams set to false is now here, if I add another one, let's say 7th to-do task, as we can see here, this is a static page over here. We're not going to see it added to the list here. But even if I go to MongoDB and let me just open this up and refresh to get this 7th task we just created. So I'm going to grab this ID. So trying to do the same thing we did before, but this time, if I just go into this first task and paste in the ID that we got from the 7th task, we're going to 404 this time because we set the dynamicParams to false, which means if the user is trying to access an ID or a path or a value that was not generated or returned from generateStaticParams, we're going to 404. Okay, let's recap. So inside of our SSG folder, let me just close this off so we understand what we're doing here. So for our statically generated pages, if we were on the index page, this is a static page over here, all we needed to do to mimic the getStaticProps function of the pages directory, we had to export this dynamic config option. either leave it alone because it defaults to auto, which instructs NextJS to cache as much as possible, or set it to error specifically to say, hey, this page needs to be static, and if it is using anything dynamic, just error out. And for the dynamic part of it, which was this ID, all we needed to do to statically build these pages was to export a function called generateStaticParams, which tells NextJS what paths to actually generate statically. And then with the use of this dynamicParams config option, we could decide what should happen if the user is trying to access a segment or a path that has not been generated statically and was not returned from this generateStaticParams function. If it was true, which is the default, it's going to go ahead and render this page component and try to render that page dynamically at request time. And if we set it to false, just as how we saw it, it 404s. Now let's actually dive into the SSR and see what happens for our SSR page and this dynamic ID inside of it. So at the page level, what we did is we exported this dynamic config option and set it to force dynamic to change this page to a servlet rendered page. So it makes sure that this page is forced to render dynamically at all times. We also saw that instead of this, we could have just exported the revalidate to 0, which does the same thing. Again, we're going to go ahead with what the documentation says about exporting this dynamic to force dynamic. Now for this page that is responsible for rendering that dynamic part, as you can see here, this is very similar to the page component that we just saw in the static, and it's not exporting any options. So let me just open them side by side. So inside of the SSG, we have this page component over here, and inside of this SSR, we have this page component over here. Just close this off. We're not actually talking about this. So we have these two pages. One of them is for SSG, which we just saw with the use of this generateStaticParams and dynamicParams. The other one, which is SSR, and we want to dynamically render, we haven't exported any options. And the reason is because this is a dynamic path inside of this ID, if we do not include this generateStaticParams, NextJS is not going to dynamically generate any of these pages for this SSR. So we are not instructing it to build anything statically. And as you remember, this dynamicParams defaults to true. So by me not including anything, I'm basically saying don't build anything statically, and my dynamicParams option is defaulting to true, which means that you need to generate these pages at request time, on demand, dynamically. Now to actually demonstrate that this is happening, if I go back to my home page and inside the SSR index, we can see all the 7 tasks are here because this is rendered dynamically. So it updates with the latest task we have over here. And if I now just open my MongoDB and actually go to the first task, let's say, and edit this task, and let's just add some exclamations to the end of the title. So let's close this off. Now, if I go ahead and open up this first to-do task, we should be able to see this updated task with the exclamation marks. Again, because this page is rendered always dynamically at request time. And the reason for it is that we are not exporting the generateStaticParams to build it statically. And because the dynamicParams config option defaults to true, it means that any page that wasn't returned from generateStaticParams, in this case, we don't even have that function, should be always rendered at request time or dynamically on demand. This is obviously in contrast with the statically built pages that is not going to change with the updated task. Now, with these two out of the way, the only thing remaining is our dynamic ID inside of our ISR or incremental static regeneration. So let's look at that component here. As you can see, we are still rendering that same page component that fetches our to-do, very similar to the static site generation with this generateStaticParams. So we have the same thing over here. We are generating some pages statically. The only difference is that we are exporting this revalidate config option with the value of 10 seconds, which means that NextJS is going to invalidate the cache and regenerate these pages after 10 seconds. Now, similar to our static page, as I explained, we can also export this dynamic false, which defines the behavior of the page if the user is trying to access a page that we haven't generated. So if we set the default to false, what happens is if we create a new page or a new task and the user tries to access it, it's going to 404. Whereas without this option, if we create a new task and the user is trying to access it, it's not from the pages that we built statically. The page component will still run, will still try to generate that page on demand. And for the statically built pages, it's going to revalidate them every 10 seconds. So now to see this in action, if I go back to our home page and access this ISR or revalidate page, we see this first to do task is still showing the unupdated or the state it was at build time. If I refresh this page, we should be able to see that exclamation marks added to it. As you can see here, after the 10 seconds, NextJs regenerated this page. And if I go and access this individual task for the first time, you can see because it was revalidated, this path now has the updated task as well. I know we've covered a lot, so let's recap. To do SSR, SSG, or ISR in the app directory, we learned that we do not have the get server-side props or get static props functions we had in the pages directory. Instead, we had a simpler API that was working on top of the fetch API and React Server components. We learned that if you're using the fetch API directly to fetch data inside of our React Server components, we can pass some options to the fetch that instructs NextJs to cache the result or not cache the result, revalidate or not, and therefore create pages statically or render them dynamically at request time. We also learned that if we are not using the fetch API, we can export route config options that result in the same behavior. Specifically, we learned about dynamicParams, and revalidate config options. Now the dynamic option changes the behavior of our page or layout from fully static to fully dynamic. We learned that we can set it to force dynamic to replicate get server-side props or dynamically render the page on demand, or set it to error, which replicates the get static props or statically build the page at build time. The next one we talked about was revalidate. We learned that revalidate would allow us to revalidate or invalidate the cache or regenerate a page that was built statically without having to rebuild and redeploy our app. We could set it to false, which is the default behavior. It tries to cache as much as possible and it's not going to revalidate any of our pages unless it needs to. We could set it to 0, which would make sure that the page is rendered dynamically always, or a positive number, which was similar to the revalidate property we could have used in the pages directory to show the frequency of revalidation to Next.js for that specific page. We also talked about the dynamicParams config option that's used with the generateStaticParams function. A similar behavior to get static paths inside of the pages directory, where all you're trying to do is to instruct Next.js what dynamic segments you want to be built or generated statically at build time. The dynamicParams config option was just determining what should happen if a user is trying to access a page that wasn't created at build time. Now, I hope this video helped you learn the new mental model for data fetching in Next.js app directory. If you have any questions, like always, hit me up in the comments and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.